The settlement of Brachwood Hollow, nestled in the lower Silesian hills of Prussia, was once an unremarkable farming community, little more than a cluster of timber-framed cottages scattered along a marshy valley road. The first census of 1787 listed just 57 households, most of them peasants, cultivating rye, barley, and flax. A shallow, slow-moving tributary of the Oder wound through the hollow, often flooding in spring and leaving behind layers of black silt that nourished the fields. To the west stood the Silesian forest, dense with spruce and oak, while to the east the hills rolled into bare meadows where cattle grazed. Winters were long and bitter. Many homes were insulated with moss and straw stuffed between timber beams. The church, dedicated to St. Wenceslaus, was a squat stone building with a sharply pitched roof, its cemetery crowded with leaning wooden crosses. Brachwood's people were, by all early accounts, suspicious and insular. Travelers noted their reluctance to allow strangers to lodge overnight and their habit of shuttering windows at dusk regardless of season. As one provincial inspector, Carl Friedrich Donau, recorded in 1802, "The inhabitants show a remarkable distrust of moonlight and evening hours. Their children are not permitted out of doors past sunset. One hears a constant refrain among them that the eyes spoil by night. Such phrase I cannot locate in any broader Silesian proverb." By 1815, reports circulated in county archives of a disturbing hereditary condition. Nearly all native-born children of Brachwood Hollow began to lose their sight in adolescence. The blindness came swiftly, often between the ages of 17 and 20, sometimes earlier. The eyes first dimmed to shadows, then paled, leaving the iris clouded as though washed in milk. Physicians from Breslau visited, diagnosing congenital amaurosis, yet noting the peculiar uniformity. The condition seemed to afflict entire family lines, with scarcely an exception. One visiting doctor, Dr. Johann Müller, wrote in a letter to the Royal Medical Society in 1821, "It is as though the valley itself breeds this malady. I examined 12 youths, male and female, none older than 20, whose eyes were in varying stages of decay. The villagers spoke little of it, and when pressed, answered only, 'It comes as it always has.' They do not rage against it, but accept with a quiet, unnerving resignation." This phenomenon carried grave consequences. The village, once modestly prosperous, entered a long decline. Blind adults could not farm, and so children carried burdens in the fields while their parents stumbled in darkness. Some families sent their youngest away to Breslau or Görlitz before their time of dimming, but others clung to tradition and kept their children home, where blindness was treated less as a disease than as an unavoidable inheritance. By mid-century, Brachwood Hollow was whispered about in taverns of the region. Wagoners refused to take the road through its valley after sundown. A county report from 1846 describes unusual numbers of livestock found drowned in the marsh and increasing disrepair of farmsteads where windows are boarded though panes remain intact. Among the villagers, two families stood central, the Kranzlers and the Borzetskis. Both had lived in the hollow since at least the early 1700s and were known for their elaborate funerary customs. Records mention that they kept the bodies of the blind dead unburied for several days, singing low dirges at night, before laying them in shallow graves reinforced with charred timbers. Such practices drew disapproval from regional clergy, yet the community remained stubborn. A surviving letter from a parish priest, Father Matthias Wendt, dated 1853, reveals both frustration and unease. The Kranzlers resist every plea to alter their burial rites. They speak of the need to let the eyes cool before the ground may claim them. What theology this springs from, I cannot say. Yet I must confess, in the nights when the bodies lie within their cottages, one hears from the road a sound, like scratching or a weak tapping from within those shuttered walls. God preserve me if this is only imagination. Later folklorists would gather stories claiming that the blindness was a curse laid centuries earlier when the valley was first drained of swamp to make farmland. Others suggest it stemmed from ritual practices, ceremonies whispered of but never proven. What remains chilling is the villagers' silence. Unlike other communities afflicted with plague or famine, Brachwood's people left few petitions for help, few complaints to authorities. Instead, they buried their blind and carried on, as if such horror was the natural order. By the late 19th century, Brachwood Hollow had become less a living community and more a shadowed remnant, its population dwindling, its cottages sagging in damp earth. Yet stories of its affliction spread wider, and with them darker suspicions. The years between 1860 and 1885 yielded the first preserved personal accounts from those who had fled Brachwood Hollow before the onset of blindness. Most testimonies survive in fragments: letters sent to relatives abroad, scattered parish records, and a handful of legal depositions from inheritance disputes. Together, they form a disturbing picture of life in the valley and the villagers' peculiar resignation toward their fate. One of the earliest documents is a letter written in 1862 by Anna Kronzler, age 19, who left the hollow to work as a servant in Dresden. She died 3 years later of typhus, but her letter was preserved by her employers. "I feared to wake and find my sight gone, as it was for my brothers. It begins in the corners of the eyes where shadows grow thicker. My mother told me, 'Do not be afraid, child, it is the way of us.' But I would rather perish in a strange city than return to lie blind in the hollow. They keep things from us. I remember when Cousin Otto lost his sight, he cried for days, yet they hushed him, carried him into the cellar, and when he returned, he was silent and obedient. He would not tell me what was done below." The mention of cellars recurs throughout later testimony, suggesting some hidden practice or rite carried out in private households. In 1874, a legal quarrel in Görlitz over the estate of a deceased merchant produced an unusual testimony. One, Karl Borzetsky, a distant relative of the Hollow's Borzetsky family, swore under oath that he had escaped the valley at age 16. His words, recorded in the notarial minutes, read, "When the eyes begin to fail, the elders gather in the night. They do not speak of healing, but of preparing. My own sister was taken to the old barn by the brook, and when she came back she would not look at me, though her eyes yet saw. 2 weeks later she was blind. They say it is God's will, yet I believe they hasten it." Pressed for details, Karl refused to elaborate, only adding, "They made me swear never to speak of the rite, under pain of losing more than sight." Most striking is how few of those who left Brachwood Hollow would discuss its customs openly. A folklorist, Elizabeth Kruger, interviewed several emigrants in 1880 while compiling a survey of regional superstitions. She noted, "Those born in the hollow are hesitant to speak. When pressed, they describe childhoods filled with sudden silences, rooms forbidden after dusk, and a strict custom of keeping water basins covered at night. They claim the reflection of the eye in water draws misfortune. One woman crossed herself and whispered, 'It calls them nearer.' When I asked who she meant, she refused to say." Across these fragments, certain details repeat. Children instructed never to look at their reflection after dark. Sudden disappearances of youths in the weeks before blindness set in. The use of cellars and barns for unexplained nighttime gatherings, and absence of protest or inquiry from those who remained. These accounts gave rise to rumors that the affliction was not merely medical but cultivated, perhaps even ritualized. Whether the community hastened blindness by deliberate means or whether the blindness was incidental to something darker remains uncertain. Authorities in Breslau and Görlitz dismissed such testimonies as exaggerations of peasants or fabrications by discontented migrants. Yet the consistency of the stories unsettled investigators who later revisited the case. The 1887 Provincial Gazette noted dryly, "Reports of inherited blindness in Brachwood Hollow continue to surface. Allegations of unusual rites are hearsay, though curiously uniform. Until evidence emerges, the matter must remain of medical, not criminal concern." Thus, the valley remained largely ignored by the wider world, left to fester in secrecy, while its youth dimmed into darkness. In the parish registers of St. Wenceslas, there are names that begin but never end. Children entered in baptismal ink and then left without burial, as if they had simply dissolved into the marshes. Among them were Jacob and Matthias Kronzler, 14 and 16. Their priest at the time, Wilhelm Rauch, noted in his private diary that the family claimed the boys had gone to relatives in Görlitz, but when he searched the archives of that city, no kin could be traced. He described visiting the Kronzler cottage. The cots were made, clothing folded, yet no shoes in the house. The mother spoke through tears that her sons were not gone, only prepared. When he pressed her, she turned her eyes from me, as though my gaze itself were offense. The boys' names never appeared again in church books. A decade later, a wool trader from Liegnitz, Hermann Baer, passed through the hollow in October and wrote to his brother that he saw only half the children he remembered from earlier journeys. He recalled one girl with pale irises staring from behind a shutter, and when he asked at the tavern where the rest of the young ones had gone, he was told simply, "They were sent away." Yet the tavern keeper, in the same breath, muttered that wagons had not come for months. There noted, "I thought of livestock led to slaughter, how villagers avoid the word when strangers inquire." There was also a letter from a governess, Clara Hoff, employed briefly in 1882 by a wealthy family outside the valley. She had been born in Brachwood, but taken away at 12. When she returned as an adult to visit distant kin, she found no sign of her cousin Friedrich, who had been expected to inherit land. His belongings were still in the family loft, she wrote. A coat folded as if awaiting the season, but his bed stripped and frame bare. When she questioned her aunt, the woman answered only, "Friedrich could not be kept for long. It was his time." Clara's letter ends with a line that troubled later readers. "I heard tapping in the floorboards that night, too faint for wind, too insistent for rats. My aunt prayed aloud until it ceased." By 1890, the disappearances had become part of regional rumor. Travelers spoke of children seen in spring but missing by autumn. No graves marked their passing, no records their departure. The villagers themselves treated the losses not as tragedies but as inevitabilities, speaking of times and preparations, never of death. In 1894, the provincial authorities dispatched a surveyor, August Wernicke, to map drainage channels in the valley after repeated floods. His notes, preserved in the Breslau archives, include an incidental remark that later researchers seized upon. He wrote that many cottages in Brachwood Hollow stood on unusually deep foundations, some with entrances concealed beneath loose planks or heaps of straw. He found one such cellar in an abandoned house near the brook. The air was heavy, sour with mildew and something sharper, not wine, not rot of grain, but closer to lye or ash. Along the wall were wooden benches, narrow and low, too short for sleeping, yet too many for storage. A year later, a deserter from the Prussian army, a boy of 20 named Leonhard Tappe, was arrested near Görlitz. In his interrogation, he confessed he had come from Brachwood. The transcript of questioning survives only in fragments, but one passage is clear. "They put us below when the sight began to dim. We were told it was for rest, to cool the eyes. There was singing, not of church, but older, lower. I remember the drip of water and the smell of smoke. When I begged to be released, My uncle said, "You must lie still until it is done." Tape refused to explain what "it" meant. He hanged himself in prison 2 weeks later. Accounts collected by folklorist Elizabeth Kruger in 1898 support these hints. One informant, a washerwoman who had fled the hollow as a girl, described nights when neighbors carried boards and buckets toward the Cransler barn. "We children were told to stay in bed, yet I heard them below, voices like humming bees. My cousin Greta was taken down one night. She returned with eyes clouded, though before she had seen well. She did not cry again after that." When outsiders tried to examine the village cellars, they were met with resistance. In 1902, a local tax collector, Ernst Vogel, complained in his report that the inhabitants bar entry to their lower rooms, claiming dampness and hazard of collapse. Vogel added, "I was shown the kitchen and loft of each house, but never the earth below. In one home, the trap door was freshly nailed shut." By the first years of the 20th century, the cellar stories had spread far beyond Silesia. Newspapers in Breslau printed short pieces about the Blind Valley, speculating on inherited disease, incest, or secret cult practices. Yet no investigation penetrated the hollow fully. The villagers closed their shutters, barred their doors, and carried on as always. Children continued to vanish from registers. Youths continued to lose their sight. And beneath the cottages, in chambers where outsiders were not allowed, something waited in the dark, known only to those who were born there. The first official police record connected to Brachwood Hollow dates from April 1907, when 2 constables from Hirschberg were dispatched after reports of an abandoned wagon and traces of blood on the valley road. Their written statement, preserved in the county archive, describes a cart overturned near the marsh, the horse missing, the ground marked by dragging lines that led toward the reeds. The officers noted a scrap of linen, child's size, damp and torn at the edge, but no body was recovered. The wagon belonged to a traveling tinsmith who had passed through villages north of the hollow a week earlier. He and his daughter were never seen again. The following year, another file was opened. A school inspector traveling through the region wrote that he found no pupils older than 12 in the hollow. He pressed the families for explanation, but was told simply, "They are with the saints." The inspector complained formally, and in response the district sent gendarmes to make inquiries. Their notes mention cottages with cellars locked, windows fastened with iron nails from the inside, and an odor of damp ash. One gendarme, Franz Heller, wrote in the margin of his report, "Something was burnt here, not wood, not straw, too strong, like horn or hair." In 1911, the most disturbing discovery came. A collapsed section of earth near the Cransler property revealed a cavity, roughly 4 meters wide, shored with charred beams. Within were 6 coffins stacked without lids. The coffins contained not bodies, but only fragments, jawbones, ribs, and skulls, most too small to belong to adults. The district doctor, summoned to examine the remains, remarked that several skulls showed no sign of soil erosion, suggesting they had been exposed to air for years before burial. His notes also record the curious detail that the orbital cavities were unusually widened, as if by deliberate pressure or extraction. The villagers claimed ignorance. They told the police the earth had shifted and that the bones must have belonged to victims of a forgotten plague, yet the church registers listed no such epidemic. When asked why the coffins contained no complete bodies, one elder answered, "The rest was taken." The gendarmes pressed further, but in the night their cart was set alight in the churchyard. Lacking transport and fearful of violence, they withdrew. The files end without resolution. In the closing memorandum, dated June 11, 1911, the district superintendent wrote, The inhabitants are obstinate and hostile. Our presence provokes them. Further inquiry risks disturbance without certain gain. Recommend cessation of investigation. Thus the matter was officially closed, though copies of the reports circulated quietly among physicians and journalists who found the details too unsettling to ignore. The First World War cast a shadow over every corner of Silesia, but in Brachwood Hollow, the years between 1914 and 1919 left traces unlike anywhere else. Men from the valley were conscripted, though far fewer than from neighboring villages. Draft officers noted the unusual prevalence of medical exemption, with many recruits dismissed for ocular degeneration before reaching the age of 20. One officer, Captain Ludwig Hancke, scribbled in his field notes, "It is remarkable. These boys are broad-shouldered, sturdy, yet their eyes betray them, half-blind before manhood, a waste of soldier's flesh." Despite the draft, some villagers did march off to the front. A surviving postcard sent from the trenches of Verdun in 1916, written by Otto Borzietsky, reads, "Here the shells fall, but I still see, thank God. Yet my comrades laugh at me. They say my eyes are like smoked glass. I know it will come soon. Perhaps it is better if the French bullet finds me first." Otto never returned. Whether killed in battle or swallowed back into the silence of the hollow, no record clarifies. The war years brought shortages, yet outsiders observed that Brachwood suffered less hunger than expected. A relief officer in 1917 reported that the hollow has reserves of dried meat and grain beyond what their fields could yield. Where these stores came from remained uncertain. The officer remarked also on a strange reluctance to accept flour shipments, as though they trusted not what others had milled. In 1918, with the empire collapsing, bands of deserters roamed the countryside, raiding farms for food. Several accounts mentioned that such bands avoided the hollow. A peasant woman from a nearby hamlet later told investigators, "The deserters went everywhere. They broke into our barns, but never to Brachwood. They said it was cursed ground, that they heard cries at night from under the earth, like men buried alive." After the armistice, political turmoil reached even the secluded valley. Officials tasked with restructuring land ownership tried to survey Brachwood properties. They found most deeds missing, the church registers water-stained and unreadable, and families unwilling to provide dates of birth or death. One administrator wrote in frustration, "It is as though they keep their own calendar, their own reckoning. Children vanish, graves are empty, yet no one calls it loss. They tell me simply, 'It is the way.'" The war left the village still more isolated. Roads were damaged, bridges unrepaired, and the surrounding hamlets spoke of Brachwood with growing dread. Some said the valley had been spared shelling because the land itself repelled intrusion. Others muttered that those who returned from war blind had not caught their affliction at the front, but had carried it from their birthplace all along. By 1920, the hollow was no longer spoken of as merely unfortunate, but as uncanny. Stories of voices under floorboards, of shuttered windows even in daylight, and of youths who disappeared just as their sight began to dim became part of local rumor. Yet no investigation was attempted. The chaos of the post-war years gave the valley cover, allowing its inhabitants to continue their hidden customs in silence, while beyond, Europe tried to mend itself from catastrophe. In the summer of 1927, a young journalist named Emil Steiner traveled from Breslau to Brachwood Hollow, drawn by fragments of rumor and the hushed reports of emigrants who had fled the valley. He carried only a satchel, a notebook, and a camera, and intended to observe quietly rather than interrogate. His surviving notes and photographs form a rare, almost tangible record of life in the hollow between the wars. Steiner arrived on a humid morning in July. The road leading into the valley was overgrown, bordered by reeds taller than his waist. He wrote, "The first cottages are half hidden in mist, roofs sagging, paint long since peeled, windows dark behind grimy shutters. The smell of the marsh is strong, sour beneath the damp sweetness of rotting hay." He encountered a woman on the path who introduced herself only as Lise. She was in her early 30s, her eyes clouded faintly with the milky gray of early dimming. She spoke carefully, almost in whispers. "You should not linger. The children, they are ours and not ours. You would not understand." When Steiner asked her to clarify, she shook her head and clutched a bundle of linen. "They sleep below, always below. It is better that way." Steiner's photographs revealed the cottages in astonishing detail: timber beams warped and blackened with moisture, hearthstones cracked, and in one house, a cellar trapdoor lifted slightly, as if pressed from beneath. He attempted to gain entry, but was rebuffed by an elderly man who slammed the door with such force that Steiner noted the echo like a gunshot across water. That evening, Steiner heard noises while staying in a small inn near the brook. His notebook reads, "From the hollow comes a faint tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. At first I believed rats, but it grows louder, like steps across planks or fingers drumming on wood. I cannot see who moves, yet the sound travels from the very center of the village." He recorded sightings of children with dim eyes wandering the streets at dusk, guided by older relatives. One boy stumbled into the road, tripping over his own feet, and when Steiner tried to help, the child whispered, "Do not touch me. I will see nothing again if I go wrong." The boy's stare, clouded yet intent, left Steiner with the sense of encountering a life already half lost. Steiner left the hollow the next day, but his impressions remained vivid. His report, never published at the time for fear of ridicule, notes, "I cannot say this is supernatural, nor can I call it natural. Something in the hollow bends both sight and reason. The families carry secrets in their walls and perhaps beneath them. Those who are born there vanish in ways one cannot fully trace." The photographs, later discovered in a private collection in 1932, showed doors tightly fastened from within, uneven cobblestones glistening with moss, and shuttered windows reflecting sunlight in a way that almost seems to conceal shadowy shapes beyond the glass. Steiner's visit was the first post-war glimpse of the hollow through the eyes of an outsider, and it is the last complete record of the village before the political upheavals of the 1930s reached Lower Silesia. In 1935, during renovations on the oldest Kranzler property, workers uncovered a hidden stairwell beneath the kitchen floor, sealed for decades with rotting planks and mud. The carpenter, a man named Friedrich Lenz, recalled the moment in a later affidavit. "I struck the floor with my axe, and it gave way like paper. Beneath was darkness. A smell rose immediately, musty, sour, with something sharper, like burnt bone. I could not see, only hear, tapping, soft, deliberate, coming from below." Investigators summoned from Hirschberg found a narrow cellar, roughly 2 meters wide and 6 long, reinforced with blackened timber. The walls bore scratches and shallow grooves, as if small hands had scraped desperately. Inside were remnants of bedding, cracked clay pots, and a scattering of human bones, mostly children's, arranged in no discernible order. One skull bore evidence of deliberate removal of the ocular sockets, a detail noted in the police report with visible horror. Orbital cavities empty, edges smooth, as though the eyes were taken with care. Among the debris were scraps of clothing, embroidered linen, and fragments of letters in the Kranzler handwriting. One partially legible note read, "The time comes. We keep them below until the eyes are cooled. Then they may join the others." Another, in faded ink, stated simply, "Do not look, do not speak, do not remember. The hollow is patient. Local folklore suddenly gained a grim dimension. Villagers who had once refused to speak now whispered of the cellars beneath the floors and of nightly chants in the dark. One elderly woman recounted, trembling. They sang softly, the ones who had dimmed eyes. We children were told not to peek, but sometimes I did, and I saw them lying quietly, waiting, their eyes gone, their mouths moving in wordless song. The excavation revealed additional chambers, small niches hidden behind false walls, each containing more bones and fragments of clothing. The investigators described the air as stale and acrid, almost oily, and noted a faint trace of burnt hair. Beyond the tangible horrors, the silence of the hollow pressed upon them. No explanation, no surviving witness could account fully for what had transpired in those decades. By the time the final chambers were exposed, several investigators refused further entry, citing mental distress and illness caused by proximity to the site. The Cransler property was condemned, but the hollow itself remained largely untouched. Families who had once lived there either died, fled, or vanished entirely. Even decades later, the discovery was never fully explained. Scholars debated whether the blindness was hereditary, environmental, or the result of deliberate ritual practices, but evidence remained fragmentary. What is certain is that Brachwood Hollow harbored secrets beneath its floors, dark, deliberate, and maintained over generations, leaving an imprint on every account, letter, and photograph that survived. Some things, one police memorandum concluded, are better left unseen. The hollow keeps its own counsel, and it has always been patient.
By 1940, Brachwood Hollow had become a shadowed name whispered across the surrounding valleys. The Cransler and Borsetsky properties stood abandoned, roofs collapsing under the weight of decades, and the marshes slowly reclaiming the fields. Few dared enter, and even fewer survived the damp cold of the hollow long enough to recount anything beyond vague impressions. The stories persisted in local letters and diaries. One account, from a school teacher in nearby Jowar, describes a child visiting from Brachwood. Her eyes were pale, like mist over the river. She walked the playground as if half-blind already, yet she spoke softly of the places below, where children sleep until their eyes are ready. I asked her to explain, and she shook her head violently, as if the very act of speech would summon something. Folk memory was equally vivid. Villagers recalled seeing lights flicker in shuttered windows at night, long after the homes were empty. Others reported faint tapping sounds from the earth itself, echoing the rhythm described in Emil Steiner's photographs decades earlier. These accounts were never formalized in police reports, but circulated in letters to local newspapers and between families. Archaeological interest in the hollow remained minimal until after World War II. By 1946, the region became part of Poland, and the few remaining ethnic Germans were expelled or fled. Polish settlers encountered the abandoned houses, and tales of dim-eyed children and hidden cellars quickly became local legend. One elder of the new village said in 1947, "The earth remembers them. When you walk through the hollow, the soil feels tight, as if it holds its breath. We do not disturb it." Some artifacts survived in private collections, fragments of embroidered linens, photographs taken by Steiner, and a few letters from exiles. Scholars noted that these remnants painted a coherent, though horrifying, picture, a valley where blindness was not only hereditary, but tied to secret practices, cellars, and strict family obedience. Still, some questions remained unresolved. How much of the affliction was biological? How much deliberate? Were the cellars a repository for children too soon dimmed, or a site of ritual that extended over generations? The hollow itself became a kind of spectral presence. Modern maps marked the cottages as ruins. The marshes swallowed the roads. Yet locals continued to refer to it simply as Wimarld, the dead place. Hikers reported a strange quiet, broken only by the occasional tapping or the fleeting shadow of a figure with pale eyes glimpsed behind a shutter. Letters collected in the 1950s recorded similar impressions. It feels wrong to look, as if the earth would punish you. Even the wind seems afraid to move there. By mid-century, Brachwood Hollow existed more in the imagination than in living memory. A cautionary tale, a warning of secrets kept too long, a place where generations disappeared quietly into darkness. Its legend endured, woven into the folklore of Lower Silesia, an eerie testament to families whose customs were fatal and patient, leaving only fragments, whispers, and the empty hollows of once bright eyes.
In 1952, a small team of ethnographers and medical researchers from Brachwood returned to Brachwood Hollow, now largely overgrown and almost entirely abandoned. Their goal was to document local folklore and gather any surviving artifacts related to the centuries-old affliction. Among their notes, one field researcher, Dr. Helena Sadowska, wrote, "The cottages are skeletons of timber and brick. Doors hang from one hinge, windows gape like empty eyes. The marsh has reclaimed the orchard. Even the air is thick with the memory of dampness and decay. Every floorboard creaks as though it remembers those who walked upon it." The researchers found remnants of the hidden cellars described decades earlier, partially collapsed, but still containing evidence of past occupation, fragments of children's clothing, scorched wood, and bits of pottery. Sadowska recorded a chilling detail. Some of the beams were carved with tiny notches, regular as counting marks, perhaps keeping track of time or numbers of children. "I counted at least 20 such marks along one beam." Local accounts were scarce, but persistent. Elderly residents of nearby villages recalled being warned never to venture into the hollow, citing both superstition and fear. Quote, "Even the blind who grew up there would not speak. They say if you look too long, the hollow will call you down." One man, a former field worker, added, quote, "I saw figures moving in the shadows, not like ghosts, like children, but not quite alive. Their eyes were white." Medical examinations of surviving immigrants failed to clarify the condition. Several individuals, now in their 50s and 60s, reported partial vision loss, but none could fully account for the uniformity and timing of the blindness described in earlier records. No environmental toxin was identified, no genetic explanation entirely satisfied the pattern. One researcher concluded, quote, "We can catalog symptoms, we can record oral history, but the phenomenon resists categorization. It is as if the hollow itself intervenes." In addition to physical evidence, the ethnographers documented ritualistic artifacts, burnt fragments of wood, clay vessels, and faint traces of what appeared to be ash mixed with soil. The arrangements suggested careful placement rather than casual disposal. Dr. Sadowska noted, quote, "The site retains intentionality. Every item seems positioned, almost ceremoniously. It is impossible to know for what purpose, yet the weight of deliberation is undeniable." By the end of the study, Brachwood Hollow was recognized less as a village and more as a locus of enduring mystery. Modern roads skirted the valley entirely. Maps labeled it a ruin. Yet even in 1952, those who approached the site reported the same oppressive atmosphere described by Steiner decades earlier. Silence broken by faint tapping, the cold, damp air, and the feeling of being watched. The researchers left with photographs, field notes, and fragments of letters, evidence enough to confirm centuries of dark history, yet insufficient to solve its central enigma. "The hollow does not yield its secrets," Sadowska wrote in her final report. "It is patient, and we are intruders." By the late 1950s, the hollow existed mainly in memory and rumor. Few families had survived its traditions, yet descendants carried subtle traces of the valley's legacy. Letters and diaries from these individuals reveal an unsettling persistence of the old patterns. One surviving document, a letter from 1957, written by Martha Borsetsky, who had been sent away at age 12, recounts her lifelong fear. "I was taken from the hollow before my eyes dimmed, yet I feel its pull even now. At night, I dream of cellars, of whispers and tapping. I awake certain I will never see fully again, though my vision remains. I hear my cousins' voices beneath the floorboards, calling, waiting. No one believes such things, but I remember the smell, the ash, the soft chant of women in the dark." Another account comes from a former schoolmate, Ernst Kronzler, now living in Wrocław. "My father spoke of the nights when children were carried away. I was too young to see, but I heard them crying in the walls. Even now, when I walk near the marsh, I feel the eyes of the hollow upon me. Friends ask why I avoid reflection in water, and I cannot tell them it is instinct, or else they would not believe me." In 1962, a folklorist conducting oral interviews recorded a chilling detail. Villagers still left small offerings, candles, scraps of cloth, and coins at the edge of the marsh where Brachwood Hollow had once stood. Locals whispered that these gestures were intended to appease those who sleep below, a phrase passed down from the last inhabitants. The folklorist noted, "Even without contact, the valley asserts its influence. Its traditions survive in superstition, fear, and ritual decades after the village itself ceased to function." Physical traces persisted as well. In the early 1960s, a construction crew surveying the land for new roads unearthed small fragments of timber, partially charred, and shards of children's clothing in shallow graves near the old Kronzler homestead. The crew reported that the soil seemed to shift beneath their feet, and several workers claimed they heard faint tapping, consistent with every historical account. Despite modern investigations, the hollow remained fundamentally unknowable. Descendants of the original families carried memories of rituals, hidden rooms, and children lost to darkness, yet the precise mechanisms, biological, cultural, or deliberate, were never determined. The valley had, in effect, become a repository of absence, leaving behind only fragments, whispers, and the lingering sensation of unseen watchers. "I cannot say if it is curse or tradition," Marta Borsetsky concluded in her letter, "but the hollow waits, and we are always aware it does." By this time, Brachwood Hollow had transformed in public imagination into a cautionary tale, a place where the innocence of youth was stolen, where silence and obedience were enforced by unknown hands, and where darkness, both literal and metaphorical, remained patient, deliberate, and eternal. By the late 1970s, Brachwood Hollow existed almost entirely as ruin and memory. The marshes had swallowed most of the original road, and the cottages were little more than skeletal frameworks of timber and stone. Yet the story persisted in local consciousness, carried in fragments by descendants, emigrants, and the few remaining residents of neighboring villages. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a journal kept by Helena Nowak, a granddaughter of families who had fled the hollow. In 1976, she wrote, "I grew up hearing about the hollow as a place where eyes fail and children vanish. I never went there, but the stories never left me. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I imagined the tapping beneath the floorboards, the soft chant, the shadows of figures moving where no one walks. My mother's words haunt me. Do not look too long. They are patient." Occasional excavations in the 1960s and early 1970s turned up further fragments, burned wood, shards of pottery, tiny carved notches in remaining beams, and partial skeletons, always of children, never adults. Forensic examination noted that the orbital cavities of the skulls were, in several cases, deliberately hollowed. These finds corroborated earlier accounts of ritualized activity in the cellars, though no living witness could fully explain their purpose. Local folklore began to blend with fact. Villagers told of strange lights flickering among ruins at night, of the marsh seeming to breathe, and of pale-eyed figures glimpsed from the tree line. One former resident said, "Even after we fled, I felt the hollow calling, as though it were not empty. It waits beneath the earth for those who belong." Despite decades of study, historians, ethnographers, and medical researchers could only piece together fragments. Questions remained. Were the disappearances a form of cultural control, a hereditary disease, or something more deliberate? Were the rituals intended to preserve, punish, or conceal? And most hauntingly, did the hollow itself exert some unspoken influence over those born there? The hollow's influence persisted not just in memory, but in practice. Descendants of the original families maintained subtle traditions, avoidance of reflections, silent observance of boundaries, and the telling of cautionary tales to children. Scholars noted the psychological imprint even generations later. The valley's legacy shaped behavior, fear, and perception. Brachwood Hollow is not gone, Helena Nowak concluded. It exists wherever its stories are told, wherever caution is learned, wherever silence is observed. Its darkness does not end with ruins or time. It waits, patient as ever. By the end of the 20th century, the hollow had become part of regional legend, a site of lingering dread, a cautionary tale of family secrets, hereditary malady, and human obedience to unseen forces. The valley remains largely unvisited, its cellars filled with the earth and ash of centuries, while the marsh quietly reclaims the roads. Those who study it leave with more questions than answers. Yet one certainty persists. In Brachwood Hollow, sight was never guaranteed, and some darkness endures far longer than human memory.